morning and welcome back to the lecture series. We are discussing features of the novel, and today we are going to discuss Lewis Carroll's very important work, Through the Looking Glass. So, before we look at the text, let's talk a little about Lewis Carroll. Lewis Carroll was born as Charles Ludwig Dawson, and he was a renowned Victorian English author, logician, mathematician, and photographer. Carroll was successful in his study of mathematics and writing, and he remained at the college after graduation to teach. One of his favorite models was a young girl whose name was Alice Liddell, and it is said, a lot of critics say that Alice Liddell played a very crucial role, a very inspiring role in his writing of the Alice series. So his Alice series is dedicated to this little girl that he had met. Alice Liddell was the daughter of the dean at Christ's Church, who later became the basis for Carroll's fictional character Alice, for which he is known. So, many of Lewis Carroll's philosophies were based on games. His interest in logic came purely from the playful nature of its principle rather than its uses as a tool, right? So, he was more interested in logic merely because of its playful nature. And so, here we see his interest in childlike things, in the vision of the child. That's something that had always interested Lewis Carroll, although he was a mathematician himself. Carroll primarily wrote comic fantasies and humorous verse that were often very childlike. Carroll published his novel Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in 1865, followed by Through the Looking Glass, which was published in 1872. Alice's story began as a piece of extemporaneous whim, which was meant to entertain three little girls on a boating trip in 1862. Both of these works were considered as children's novels that were satirical in nature. So, they had a very strong element of satire built in them, and they were seen as manifestations of Carroll's wit. Carroll's poem Jabberwocky is also famous because he created nonsensical words from word combinations. This is a tendency that we have also seen in other writers, appealing to and inspired by this subgenre of nonsense literature, where new words are coined, new fictional animal-like figures and fantastic, elements are created in order to evoke, amazement, wonder, a breakaway from boredom, and of course, in order to evoke laughter and mirth. So, these are all, created in the stories, created in the plots to attract children, the juvenile audience, but also they appeal alike to the adults, the adult readers and audience. The story of Through the Looking Glass describes Alice's adventures as she moves symbolically from being a child to becoming an adult in a strange world entered through a mirror that is placed above her drawing room fireplace. The landscape there is in the form of a giant chessboard, and Alice enters the game as a white pawn. She travels across the chessboard and she is crowned as the queen at the 8th square. along the way, along her way of traversing through this chessboard, Alice encounters some of Carroll's most memorable and enduring characters that already appeared in the previous series of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and among them, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, the walrus and the carpenter, the lion and the unicorn, and the Jabberwock, of course, are worth mentioning. So, the book is also filled with many fine nonsense poems and songs that easily, rivets the reader. The reader, child and adult alike, are carried away by these nonsense poems and songs that are so joyful and so unique in their nature. The story ends with Alice waking from a dream, but the tone of the book is altogether more that of melancholy. So, there is a melancholic tone, dominating the narrative, a melancholic narrative pervasive throughout the narrative, and the narrative is prefaced by an extremely sad poem which reflects Carroll's own feelings about his young child friends growing up and entering the adult world. So, there are two of these things that act as a driving force of this this writing. On the one hand, his love for his child friend Alice. On the other, the very thought, the sad thought that every child has to grow up, and the childhood and all the dreams, the fantasies, the amazement, the wonder associated with it has to be left behind in order to enter or cross the threshold of adulthood. So, both these kinds of feelings, the joy and the melancholy, have mixed together and inspired this narrative through the Looking Glass. By the time Looking Glass was published, Alice Liddell, the little girl's figure that had inspired Lewis Carroll into writing the Alice series, had turned 19 years old, and Carroll would rarely see her, although he remembered her very fondly for the rest of his life. So, Carroll did, however, send 3 advance copies of the book to the Liddell family, with the one for Alice being bound in Morocco, as he noted in his diary. So, in Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures series or stories, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, language works at all levels. So, here we know that it's meant mainly for the juvenile audience, but the inbuilt satire and the very crucial role of language in the work is something that needs to be further examined and understood. The organization of relationships, of series, the syntactical functioning, the production of meaning, the mastery of signification, the movement from designation to expression, and the totality of operations executed by the system of language on its own body can only be perceived precisely only if the reader's ear is ready to hear the beat or the rhythm of the text, the beat that plays throughout the text. One should therefore, as far as possible, have recourse to the English text in order not to miss the effect, the sonorous effect, the sonority that the book has to offer. Humpty Dumpty, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, the appearance and disappearance of characters in this work Through the Looking Glass is apparently not caused by any demands of the plot, and so the logic of their appearance and disappearance rests on different bases, right? So, logic is certainly not the factor that drives or propels the story forward. Why these fantastic characters, these extraordinary, remarkable characters keep coming in and going out cannot be defined and deciphered through logic. The pawns have their places already fixed from the moment when Alice sets the game of chess in motion. So, they are all not only characters, but pawns in the larger scheme that is symbolized through the chessboard. And so, with the result, what happens is that the kings, the queens and knights are foreseeable up to their smallest gestures, right. So, once again going back, there can be two kinds of interpretations for reading a text. One is a literal, where the character is a character. Another is the metaphorical or symbolic, where the character stands for an archetype. An archetypal reading takes us out of the individual character and makes the reader concentrate more on the scheme of the novel, right, or the scheme of the work. So, it's primarily, in the case of Carroll's characters, it is primarily in obedience to the orders of the language to which they belong, at once on a semantic level and then also on a phonetic level, that Humpty Dumpty and Tweedledum and Tweedledee make their appearance in a cleverly multiplied series of echoes, right. Their appearance is happening also on a sonorous mode. You can hear them appearing and disappearing, right. It is happening in terms of multiplied series of echoes. So, Egg, one of the major characters, Egg, is full of himself and epitomizes the word's desire for self-expression. Humpty refers back to Dumpty, right. We say Humpty Dumpty together. And this is like the redoubling of his very name. Everything comes back to what Humpty decides to be, but at the same time he is already himself quoted, repeated, imported from the nursery rhyme, which tells of his fall and his breaking into pieces. So, he is already there in the literary cultural repertoire, from where he can hardly deviate much, right. So, although he is himself, he is also referring to the way he is remembered in the children's poem. So, Humpty Dumpty is produced by the phonemes of his own name. While he comes back into the book as the plot requires, the appearance of Egg is an example of the double functioning of the text, the two functions at which the text operates at the level of the signifiers by its surface sound, right. So, while Humpty Dumpty comes back into the book as the plot requires, the appearance of Egg is an example of the double functioning of the text at the level of the signifiers by its surface sound. So, couple in himself, the Egg makes a couple with a pair of equally round twins whose names are Tweedledum, Tweedledee, and they revolve around a common onomatopoeia. So, when we say twiddle, it refers to scratching an instrument, and this results in producing a series of sharp sounds. The name itself has a sound meaning associated and intrinsic to it. So, complementary rivals as they are, they work by doubling and by overbidding. Their discourse is less a conveyor of meaning and more a producer of piercing notes. So, here we can see that the one could say that the narrative operates very much like a poem. A poem does not have a meaning, a poem just exists, and it is the meaning in the way it is, in the way it exists, the way we read it. The meaning is inbuilt in the form, the meaning is inbuilt in the sonority, in the way it performs itself, the way it is read. The meaning cannot be dissociated and placed on top of or you know, above the form, or alongside the form, or apart from the form. You know, the meaning is the form and vice versa. Because the object of desire in Alice's narrative is a certain knowledge which cannot be dissociated from language, or perhaps language itself. So, because the object of desire in Alice's narrative is a certain knowledge which cannot be dissociated from language, or perhaps it is language itself, the other side frequently refers to the sonorous aspect of things or of words, right. This is what I have been trying to explain just now, that the language is the meaning. There is no such thing as the meaning of the language. The language, the way it performs, the way it exists, just as in the case of poetry, you know, bears its meaning by virtue of existing in in terms of a certain constellation of words and expressions. So, the characters, the texts belong to the same listening pattern. Their actions often represent roles in sounds. So, Carroll wants to tell a story to a little girl, but the story loses its way and the little girl changes, right. Just like the story is waylaid, the child cannot remain a child forever, and that is where the melancholic tone comes from. The little girl has to grow up and become an adult. Desire of holding on to childhood, the childhood wonder and amazement remains alone. The desire almost becomes a lonely entity, master of the space which is oriented by no time. So, desire becomes almost static in time, the desire to hold on to childhood, whereas the child grows up. Desire remains alone, master of the space which is oriented by no time, whereas on the edge of the text, he who gave the signal for departure laments and confides the anguish of an ancient masochistic adolescent to its moist verses. To put it very simply, this narrative draws its lifeblood from the melancholic thought that every child has to, after all, grow up. And so, the verses, as critics would observe, as many critics have noted in the case of Alice stories, the verses are moist, the verses have this kind of a lament, you know, informing them. So, everything happens as though Carroll, instead of taking the risks of loss, saw himself at risk. So, rather than taking the risk of loss of time, risk of loss of life, of strength, of meaning, Carroll sees himself at risk. And in fact, he is riling in this risk, he is enjoying and taking pleasure in this risk, and he exploited this kind of pleasure by writing down the risk, by writing down this sense of loss of time, life, strength, meaning through the nonsensical verses. Nothing can be grasped and kept forever. That is the kind of melancholia and pleasure that informs the text, right? Nothing is forever. That is the kind of risk he is undertaking when he is writing the Alice series, right? And we see that very remarkably, the process of writing also sometimes appeared to frighten him. But he would not be daunted. He kept writing, he kept exercising his authorial freedom. The axis of patience action runs right through the landscape, and the chessboard, which also revolves around the axis of knowing or pretending to know, uh, is is something that we readers keep coming back to again and again. If Humpty Dumpty impresses Alice because he makes words say what he wants them to say, at the same time Humpty Dumpty also has the limitation, because he does not ask any questions about the place of origin of these words. He can make the words say what he wants them to say, but he doesn't know their origin, where they come from. While Alice, who is obstinate, shrewd, enterprising, ignorant, curious, and dissatisfied, makes people write, and she holds the king's pencil. That is something very symbolic. She holds the king's pencil, and the act of writing is thereby transformed, because another text steers beneath the royal text, right? On the other hand, we see Humpty Dumpty, who is a master of meaning, says his claims are only of any value in the world of meaning. So, one can become a master of meaning only in a world of meaning. If there are no meanings, then how can one master meaning? How can one make words say? Everything becomes futile, right? And Alice is symbolic of the parallel writing that she steers beneath the royal text. She is creating a kind of counter text, a subtext that is also a counter text. So, Humpty Dumpty takes the words, but the meanings evaporate. He must speak to get the words to consent, and when he breaks off the recitation with a but, nobody knows whether the silence into which he is absorbed is an effect of his power or an effect of his importance, right? So, Helen Sisu has studied this work and makes some very important remarks on Carroll's adventurous fairy tales. So, according to Sisu, if all Carroll's tale is only discourse, so that discourse is character, discourse comprises subject, plot, reality, and so on. It is only so in a state of dissolution. Even talking about the conditions of the work is already reading after, right? So, sustaining one's reading by the scaffolding of the ready-made structures of the language while the text remains unattainable, right? So, even I would just repeat this, even talking about the conditions of the work is already reading after. It is not the work, it is a commentary on the work, it is a critique of the work. And like E. M. Foster says, the critique of any work, as good as it may be, can take off on a different plane, and it can actually pursue a completely different future from the work itself. Such reading is actually braced or supported by some ready-made structures of the language, whereas the text remains unattainable. So, the reading of the text is the reading of the text, it is not the text. The meaning or the realization of the text is inbuilt in the text itself. If Through the Looking Glass is the story of a surface which is told between game and dream, the story as if performs between dream and dream, it is also the mantle of a drama whose obsessive features produce from the very first a strongly symbolic space. And then Sisu says, if the object of Alice's dream dreams her as dreamed in her dream, where is she what she is? An exchange of being between dreamer and dreamed perpetuates the uncertainty and raises the question of knowledge, knowledge in the primal sense. Is she, who is the Alice, the dreamer or the one in the dream? Or and are they exchangeable? Are they exchanging positions, right? So, what are we reading basically? Are we also dreamers? Are we also dreaming this text? Does this text actually exist? Or so the blurring between reality and dream is existent at all levels, right? And that's how this wonderful work performs. So, Lewis Carroll's first biographer, Stuart Dodson Collingwood, claims that the Alice books became primers for many Victorian children, and lines from these books were cited in the daily press as often as lines from Shakespeare. This makes us wonder how popular the Alice series must be, as popular as Shakespeare's plays. If the popularity of the tales among children has since been eclipsed by the presence of cartoons manufactured in the television studio, then their adventures have nevertheless maintained the status of cultural myth in the adult world. So, having moved in a way from the children's domain, it has become a cultural myth in the adult world. Much of the Alice series' popularity is owing to the sophisticated problems in physics, metaphysics, logic and semantics. All of these are domain of the adults, right, which surface time and again during the course of Alice's wanderings. As fiction, the books have presented readers and critics with an equally formidable problem of decodification. The puzzle that the Alice series has to offer has created wonder in children as much as among the adults. So, and they are this puzzle, this game of codification and decodification can be also seen as frightening, almost formidable. So, like their folktale counterparts, Carroll's narratives abound in the imagery of sexual fantasy. There are mentions of rabbit holes, magic potions which produce bodily metamorphosis, decapitation, threats, desires to become a queen. All of these can be explained through psychological analysis, through psychoanalytic lens. We have a lot of these explained in Freudian terms. And yet the imagery itself is no more prolific than we would find in any other fairy tale or any other work from the similar genre. The heterogeneity of approaches to Carroll's Alice, or Alice's rather, is sanctioned by the overdetermination of semantic possibilities in the texts. And yet there have been very few attempts to discover a structural pattern in the narratives which could integrate various hermeneutic models. The longevity of the tales is guaranteed precisely because of their enigmatic quality. The sense of the adventures is analogous to all the riddles with no answers that we face as humans, that life poses to us. Their aesthetic value lies in their insolubility. Because they do not have any answers, these riddles posed by life are all the more interesting, all the more formidable. These are the puzzles that remain puzzles basically. And if Alice were to find a solution either to the riddles or to her own motives for journeying into the imaginary world of unconscious possibilities, the rationale for her nonsense adventure would evaporate. It would just disappear, right? Just because they don't have answers, are they so amazing, so fantastic? Carroll's fiction illustrates the importance of paradox in human language generally and the complex interrelations of the linguistic science and its referent in symbolic discourse. So, Carroll's Alices are also symptomatic of a genre of modernist fiction which has continued to nurture paradox. In fairy tales and in dream fiction, the hero's acceptance of the impossible is not merely an ironic device, but it serves to indicate the audience that the surrealistic episodes are meant to be understood metaphorically. We are not supposed to take them literally and analyze them. If we do that, we would be inadequate in terms of our understanding. Alice never questions the reality of the worlds underground where she's traveling in her imagination, right? She never questions that underground world and the world that exists behind the looking glass. She even agrees to believe in the unicorn if he will believe in her. That is the innocence of the child we are celebrating in the novel. If the fiction believes in reality, the reality is willing to believe in fiction and fantasy. That is the kind of pact that little Alice and unicorn have among themselves, right? Between themselves. So, as in actual dreams, it is her literal existence above ground which is in question throughout the narratives. So, the author's premise is that the world underground, the world beyond the looking glass actually exists, and that world actually in turn puts to question the life above ground, the life outside of the looking glass, right? The absurdity of Alice's adventures points up the absurdity of waking experience if only during the time of the dream. So, the life in the state of being awake is rendered absurd, and the absurd life is actually shown as real. Although Alice protests that one cannot believe impossible things, she accepts the fact that she is speaking to an impossible white queen who, when she was her age, used to practice believing in 6 impossible things before breakfast. So, I mean, she is speaking to someone that is an impossible white queen who as a child would actually practice believing 6 impossible things every day before breakfast. So, to such a person you cannot say that I cannot believe in impossible. That person has practiced believing in impossible. So, like all fairy tale heroines and all dreamers, Alice must eventually awaken to discover that she has been only dreaming. Yet even after the return to consciousness, Carroll forces the reader to believe one more impossible thing, that behind the looking glass, Alice is presented with the dilemma of deciding whether she is part of the Red King's dream or he is part of her dream. Whether someone is dreaming of her and that is how the narrative is happening, or someone is part of her dream, right? So, it is that old insoluble paradox of idealist philosophy, one which continues to haunt Alice even after she awakens, since there are no grounds for proving that her return to consciousness is not also a part of the dream. Where does the dream stop and the reality begin? Can we say that with the end of the dream and with her return to consciousness, the dream is over, or does it still continue? It is kind of seamless, and that is what makes it so wondrous. So, Alice is after all only a sort of thing in Carroll's dream, one who would indeed be nowhere, as Tweedledee remarks, if the dreamer left off dreaming, right. So even not only the dream, but Alice would perhaps cease to exist if the dreamer left off dreaming. She is a figment of the dreamer's imagination. Carroll's interest in perpetuating the ambiguity is more poignant in Through the Looking Glass, which is a sequel of Wonderland. I am going to stop my lecture here today, and let's meet again for another round of discussions in another lecture. Thank you.